Well, my name's Jordan Swain Fox. I'm the outreach coordinator for the Center for Urban and Regional Analysis, or CURA, at The Ohio State University. And we're glad to have you here today for our first webinar in the series, Is AI Sustainable? This series is co-sponsored by CURA, Sustainability Institute at Ohio State, and the Translational Data Analytics Institute, or TDAI, at Ohio State. Throughout the series, we're hearing from experts on the ramifications of the expanding use of AI and the growth of data centers. Today's guest, Julie Bolthouse, will discuss the impact of data centers in Virginia, which is the hotspot for data center growth. Before Harvey introduces Julie, I just want to mention a few logistical items today. If you require closed captioning, you'll find a box at the bottom of the screen labeled CC. Click this box and select Show Subtitles, and this will allow you to view subtitles during the presentation. During the webinar, we encourage you to submit questions at any time using the Q&A box. We'll get to as many of those questions as we can in the last portion of the presentation. And if we don't get to your question, apologies in advance. You'll notice that the chat has been disabled, so use the Q&A function if you have any information to share with the event organizers. This event is approved for one AICP CM credit. To claim your CM credits, log onto your My APA account on the APA website and enter the event into your online CM event log. At the end of the webinar, you'll have a brief survey pop up. If you have the time, we'd love for you to provide your feedback in this survey to help us improve these events. And you can reach out to me at swaim-fox.1@osu.edu if you have any questions. And I'll put that in the chat. To learn more about CURA's future events or to sign up for our monthly newsletter, visit cura.osu.edu. You can also like us on Facebook and follow us on X and Instagram. And you can learn more about Sustainability Institute and TDAI at si.osu.edu and tdai.osu.edu, respectively. With that, I'll pass it over to CURA's director, Harvey Miller, to introduce our speaker for today.
Okay, thank you, Jordan, and thank you everyone for joining us today. This is the kickoff of our Spring 2025 series on Is AI Sustainable, where we'll talk about the local, global, climate, and economic development impacts of AI and data centers, which is a topic of concern here in Central Ohio, but also in many parts of the country and indeed in the world. So I have the honor of introducing Julie Bolthouse. Julie Bolthouse is the Director of Land Use with the Piedmont Environmental Council, which is a locally based donor-sponsored 501c3 nonprofit and an accredited land trust. She manages local field staff who work in the environmental nonprofit's 9-county region that includes Clarke, Loudoun, Rappahannock, Fauquier, Culpeper, Orange, Madison, Greene, and Albemarle counties in Virginia. As Director of Land Use, Julie coordinates the organization's advocacy on state and local policies to promote smart growth and climate action while conserving and preserving the natural resources, local food system, history, and beauty of the Virginia Piedmont. A professional advocate for sustainability through thoughtful land use decisions, Julie has been with PEC for 13 years. She holds a BS in fishery science with a minor in watershed management, a master's in urban and regional planning, and a second master's degree in natural resources, all from Virginia Tech. She is a lifelong resident of Virginia and grew up in Northern Virginia, where she now lives with her family. And Julie, thanks you for joining us today, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for having me. So I'm going to give you guys a presentation about what's happening in Virginia. And if you have the opportunity, especially if you are a planner and you're dealing with data centers coming into your localities, I would encourage you to also check out Virginia APA's webinar that we held on this a couple years ago that goes into a little bit more detail about how to what types of impacts to look for from the standpoint of zoning and planning. But with that, I want to go ahead and share my screen, and hold on one second. Let me do that one more time. There we go. And you should see my presentation in front of you. Someone yell if it's not my presentation. All right, so first let's start out with what is a data center? A data center, they vary in size. Back in the early 2000s, they were much smaller, like 10,000 square foot facilities, usually integrated into like a business park with offices and things like that around it. Nowadays, what we're seeing a lot more of is hyperscale, larger facilities that are anywhere from 200,000 square foot per building to 500,000 square feet per building. And just for scale, a typical Walmart supercenter is about 180,000 square feet. So that's pretty large. These facilities don't include windows because what's inside of them is these data halls, as you see over to the side of this image here. And those are rows and rows of racks that are filled with servers that are processing data. And that is data from your devices that you use all the time, like your phone, this webinar that we're on right now, and the storage of data as well. So everything that we do in the modern era, the digital age, is going through these data centers, is being stored in these data centers. And those buildings are filled with data halls and rows of all this equipment. Well, that equipment gets really hot, and to keep it cool, facilities have a variety of different cooling systems. Sometimes they're air cooled, sometimes they're water cooled, sometimes it's a mixture of both. But they have some way to keep that equipment cool. And this facility that we're looking at is an Amazon data center built in about 2015. And on top of it is a bunch of cooling towers and air handlers and other, equipment associated with the cooling of that facility. You also have a lot of electricity that needs to get into these facilities. And so you'll see a number of utility boxes around them. But the size that they're running now, you also will usually see a substation in very close proximity to bring that power to those utility boxes. So we'll go into a little bit more about that in a minute. You also have backup power. So the power that is coming in, they want to ensure that they have zero downtime. And so if for some reason the power goes down to the facility, they want to have some sort of backup. That backup usually comes in the form of tier 2 diesel generators. And it might be different in your state. In Virginia, we call them tier 2, but basically it's lower emission standard, or they don't have as much pollution control on them as, say, a tier 4 generator would have. So they don't have SCRs or other pollutant capturing devices. But there are dozens of those associated with the backup of a facility. Each one is the size of a train car, usually about 2 megawatts or larger. They also have fuel storage to ensure a certain runtime. If there is an outage, they want to be able to keep that facility up and running with the backup diesel generators for a period of time to meet, the contracts that they hold. And so very often they'll have fuel storage on site as well. They very often have security fencing around them because they need to keep any, person away from either coming in and stealing information or messing with the equipment. And so they usually have security fencing and a guard gate to get into the facility. So what's driving all this demand? Why are we seeing so many of these data centers, and why are they getting so large? Why have we gotten to hyperscale size data centers? Well, it's a variety of different things. Outsourcing of information, so that's cloud storage, moving to the cloud, advanced smartphone technology, expansion of rural broadband, digitization and data storage, trying to move everything to virtual storage, Internet of Things, that's like, your app that allows you to control your air conditioning at home, or your, stove, cut it on to preheat or something before you get home. But the big driver right now, the thing that is really booming, really causing this boom in development, is generative AI. It is the market interest in development of AI. And so everyone is trying to make sure that they've got the head on the market, because there's a number of different companies that are trying to, compete for this market. And so you've got large cloud storage providers moving into this field like Amazon and Microsoft, OpenAI, of course, associated with Microsoft, and Google. These entities are building out massive complexes to house the future AI systems that they are planning on bringing into the market. Now, Virginia has the largest data center market in the world. I jokingly call it the Wall Street of the data center market, because everybody who's anybody is located here in Virginia, and the fiber connectivity that we have here is what, well, there's a variety of different things that attracts them to Virginia. One of them is the fiber connectivity. It's the proximity to all the other companies that are already here. It's the services that are available here. So you've got very well-trained personnel in electricity, HVAC, security, everybody who already has the training that they need to either build or run these facilities is located here in this Northern Virginia market. It's also a fairly safe location. We don't really get big earthquakes or problematic events that would cause damage to the data centers or the infrastructure that serves them. At least we don't get a lot of them. We do get the occasional tornado. But that's we also have been building this market, like I said, since the 1990s. So we had the first MAE, I can't remember the name of the fiber line that came through here, but it was a very influential line that had the build out of a number of federal facilities associated with it. And that's the other aspect, is that we're in close proximity to that national federal agencies and the government agencies that would need to use a lot of these services, like the Department of Defense and CIA and things like that. So that's how we compare. I would point out that Columbus, I don't know if you can see my cursor on here, Columbus is at about a little bit over 1 megawatt of capacity. We're at around, it's actually higher than this now, we're at like 5 megawatts here in Virginia. This is all the different companies that operate. Like I said, we're like the Wall Street of the data center industry. So just about every company has a facility here in Northern Virginia or somewhere in Virginia. Microsoft has a very large facility in South, in Mecklenburg, Virginia, which is in the South. And then we've also got a pretty large hub developing in the Richmond area as well. So all these data centers consume a huge amount of electricity. A single building can use as much as a small city's worth of power. And so to deliver that amount of power, you can't just use the power lines that are like the wooden poles that you see, within our communities. You need the larger transmission lines, which is usually a 230 kV line around here. And so that delivers power to a substation in near proximity to the data center buildings or campus of multiple buildings. And that power has to be provided and generated from somewhere. And very often, much of that power is coming from fossil fuels or coal, at least here in Virginia. We'll talk more about that in a minute, but it has to come from somewhere. And as we build out more and more generation is necessary. So how much of our power in Virginia currently goes to that huge hub of data center space that we have? 25% of Virginia electric use is consumed by the data center industry. So that's vastly more than any other state in the country. We are also the largest net importer of power. We were not as of 4 or 5 years, 4 years ago, we were second, but we've surpassed California as California has actually brought online more solar. Our energy consumption has increased so much that we've actually started to import even more, even though we are also building out a whole lot of energy generation here in Virginia as well. We've been building out solar. We're finalizing offshore wind facility. And there's a unfortunate proposal for a gas plant called Chesterfield plant. So we're building out tons of energy too, but we are consuming so much by bringing all these data centers online that we're continuing to import or it's necessary for us to import more and more. This is the projection that was put forward by our major utility where most of these data centers are located, and that's Dominion Energy. So if you look at that gray line, you can see where we've been on energy consumption since 1995. And you can see there was a little bit of an increase in the early 2000s, but generally it's been pretty flat until about 2018. And that's when we started to see a big boom in the hyperscale data center development, and we started to see a significant increase in energy consumption. And that's actually up to 23 gigawatts now. In this projection, although it hasn't been released, it's actually up by another 5 gigawatts. So it's actually 28 gigawatts of growth that they're projecting by 2040 at this point. And how does that compare to what we would have if there weren't data centers, if there wasn't data center demand? This is a graphic that was put together by the Joint Legislative Audit and Review Commission, which is a study arm of the Virginia General Assembly. They did their own independent analysis. They also include the PJM analysis, which is what we were just looking at. That's actually Dominion's forecast as well. And they compared it. And as you can see, without data center growth, we would only have 15% increase, which would mostly be due to EVs and the shift from gas within the household to electric heating, and cooling. So it's significant. We're talking about a significant increase that is being driven almost solely by data center development in our state. This is where all those data centers are being proposed. PEC's been tracking this information, so this is our map. Every time we hear about or are notified about a new data center proposal, and as long as there is an actual application in process, so we can go on to the county's, land portal or pull information from them and see an actual application that's in process and is active, then we add it to this map. And as you can see, the pink dots are the existing data centers that are already operating. The red dots are all the proposed data centers. Many of these are already approved. I would say probably about 80% of them are already approved. And so they're just not built yet. So we're waiting for site plans and for that development to start. Those pink dots make up about 57 million square feet of existing data center space or data center space that's under construction. Those red dots that you were looking at make up 189 million square feet of approved or in the pipeline data center space. So that is a massive amount that is still undeveloped and may not actually is not actually being considered in that graphic that you just saw with the skyrocketing energy demand, because they have not submitted contracts to our utility yet for power because they haven't even started constructing yet. So the power consumption is really unsustainable. We're talking about doubling a grid. I mean, keep in mind that to get to 23 gigawatts of power that we have right now in Virginia, that's taken over 100 years to build out that grid. We're talking about doubling that capacity in the next 15 years. There's a question of obviously how much of an environmental impact is this going to have on, power generation and the pollution that might be associated with that and all the infrastructure that needs to be built out. But there's another question of can you even do it, which is kind of the economic question of it. Like there's a supply chain constraint that comes into play when you consider the fact that everybody else is trying to do this at the same time. It's not just Virginia that is seeing massive load demand. Ohio is also in the PJM marketplace, and you guys are also seeing massive load demand. And if you go back to that map of the states that I had showed you, think about the net exporters of power. There's really only West Virginia and Pennsylvania that we're pulling power from in the PJM marketplace. So there's a question of, are we even going to be able to build out that much power that quickly, even with, elimination of any type of pollution controls? due to supply chain constraints and due to the costs of all the infrastructure that we would need to build out, and how long it simply takes to build out that infrastructure. It usually takes about 4 years to build a gas plant. It takes 5 to 10 years to build a transmission line. So it's a question of how can we even build out that much that quickly? So what is behind the load demand that we saw? That's not just a projection. That's just like we're, arbitrarily forecasting this load demand. It's actually based on contracts that Dominion Energy has signed with no state oversight, by the way. They're signing these contracts with the industry, without any additional review. And so when a locality approves a project here in Virginia, they don't look at the electric impact, how much power is going to be required to serve that facility. They don't look at the regional impacts on air quality. Is this consistent with the Virginia Clean Economy Act? Is this going to drive power generation? And is this going to have an impact on ratepayers in the PJM area or just even Dominion? They don't look at any of that. They look at what is going to be the impact on the community. So they might look at the aesthetics of the building. They might look at consistency with their comprehensive plan in general. They might look at lighting and traffic and things like that. They don't look at this. And so once they've approved this project, that applicant then goes to the utility, which is in this case Dominion Energy, and then they say, I have a project and I need 300 megawatts of power. They sign a contract with Dominion with an in-service date that they agree upon. And then Dominion uses these contracts to then justify the build out of new transmission lines, new power generation facilities, like I mentioned before, the Chesterfield gas plant that's proposed down in Southwest Virginia, or actually just west of, I think, Henrico County. Like, those things have massive impacts on the community. I mean, the community that surrounds that area has already been disproportionately impacted by a coal facility that used to operate there. And now they're going to be impacted by this gas facility. No one considers any of that. They just have this justification based on these contracts that have been signed by the industry and the utility. And that is used to justify the build out of all this power and the pollution that might produce. And as you can see on this graphic here from Dominion, this is a presentation they gave to their shareholders. Those contracts have increased by 5 gigawatts within just 1 year. So we've gone from 16.5 gigawatts in contract to 21.4 gigawatts in contract. Now, infrastructure costs of all that power generation and transmission lines are passed on to all the ratepayers. The data center industry is paying for their infrastructure on site, so they would be paying for their distribution lines to the facility and all those utility boxes. They're not paying for the transmission line to deliver that power because that's considered part of the larger grid, or they're paying their share, but they're not paying the entirety of it. And they're not paying for the power generation that would be necessary to produce more power to bring to that facility. And so all those costs are being dispersed across all ratepayers through transmission riders and generation riders on your electric bill. Their report that they have to produce as a part of their integrated resource plan each year includes a residential bill projection. And so this is their own analysis showing that since 2019, we've already increased to 142 or by about $20 to $142, and that is going to at least go up to $214 for every residential bill of 1,000 kilowatt hours per month. That's how much of an increase we're going to see from all of this load growth. Because remember, all the load growth is from data centers, just about. Only a very small fraction is from EV. So the entirety of this cost is being driven by the load growth from data centers. The higher projection, which is the directed methodology that the SEC asked them to do, is actually more like $315. So we're actually talking about nearly a doubling of the electric bill from where it is now, and 158% increase from where it was in 2019 when all of this development started. So what are the impacts on the resources of Virginia? And honestly, I say beyond because a lot of these resources are actually in West Virginia and Maryland. So we're bringing transmission lines from outside of our state. But first, let's talk about land consumption. So power generation and storage requires land. No matter what form of power generation you're using, it requires some sort of land consumption. So a nuclear facility, obviously, you're pulling water very often to cool it, but also you have a large piece of land that's a buffer around that facility and also just to develop the facility. Solar uses a lot of land. Obviously, the carbon impact is much less, so that's good, but it does require a lot of land. And then you've got gas, and you can't just think about the gas plant itself. You also have to think about all the creation of that gas, so the fracking and the pipelines and everything to deliver it to the facility. And then you've got transmission lines to move that power around, and that's fragmenting our forest landscape and introducing invasives in that corridor and things like that. So that has an impact on, ecosystems and biodiversity. And then the data center buildings themselves are pushing out other land uses, especially here in Virginia. So as I mentioned before, 189 million square feet of data center space is in the pipeline. And that's the equivalent of over 1,000 Walmart supercenters. So, I mean, this is a lot of land, and that's just the buildings. That doesn't include the stormwater management ponds, the parking lots, the generator yards, everything else that's associated with it, the substations. And that's happening. A lot of that data center development is happening in suburban areas, especially here in Prince William and Loudoun County, in Fairfax County, and that's pushing out planned mixed use and housing nearby. So we have a metro stop that, is pretty absurd. It's surrounded by QTS data centers and is literally just a parking garage with a bridge over to the metro. And that's really a wasted opportunity for transit-oriented development because there's really no reason. And in fact, that stop has our lowest ridership in the entire metro. And that would have been an opportunity to bring more, funding and usage and support to Metro. But instead, we've surrounded it by QTS data centers, which employ very few employees. So it's like 20 to 30 employees per gigantic building. And so no one really uses that Metro stop. And of course, you're also just seeing sprawl. I mean, these facilities are just kind of popping up in places where localities see an opportunity to bring revenue in because they do bring in a lot of revenue. The servers within the facility are taxed, and so you've got a lot of, and because they're replaced so regularly, unless they depreciate, unless they're there for longer than say 4 years or so and start depreciating, and then they're not bringing in any revenue. But generally, because of that replacement schedule, they are bringing in a lot of revenue. And then, of course, you have the increased property value as well, which brings in revenue to the locality. But you're also seeing this sprawl happening where these gigantic facilities are just popping up in odd places, and again, pushing out other types of uses. You're seeing water impacts as well. First, we'll talk about the water quality impacts. So this development, this construction is happening so fast because we're in a booming market right now. And I would argue that it's a bit of a speculative market as well. And so because this construction is happening so fast, we're seeing a lot of violations of stormwater controls. And so this is a sign that's being held by a person in Maryland. This was associated with the Quantum Loop development in Frederick County, Maryland. They were dewatering the site, and it's a brownfield site, which is good that they're redeveloping a brownfield site, not good that they were dewatering it and pumping that water into a nearby creek. And instead of actually getting a permit to do what they were doing and going through the Department of Environmental Quality in Maryland, instead they put up these signs that said possible water contamination, avoid water contact while signs are posted. People started contacting the Department of Environmental Quality, which was shocked to find out that these signs were up, and asked, there was a stop work order and they were, given violations and things like that. But this sort of thing has happened repeatedly with the construction of these facilities. And they just pay the fines and move on because they're just trying to move as fast as possible. We're seeing water used for two main purposes. First is direct use for cooling. Like I said, not every data center uses water for cooling. Some of them are just using air, but the ones that do use water and have cooling towers can use a lot of water. It just depends on the system that they're using, and if they have a closed loop system or if it's, just evaporative system. But the point is, the water consumption that we've seen in Loudoun County has increased drastically. I'll show you a graphic of that in just a minute. But the other use of water that we're seeing increase is the indirect use for cooling of power plants. So not just nuclear plants need potential water cooling, but also gas plants use a lot of water for cooling as well. So this is a graphic from Loudoun County. I talked about the increase in water. If you look at this map, you'll see that there's purple stars on here that are showing the data centers that are using reclaimed water. And initially, like back in, early 2000s to about 2018, almost all the data centers were on the reclaimed water system within Data Center Alley. But because water consumption has increased so much, and because the development has started to sprawl out away from that gray water line, that reclaimed water line, you're seeing a lot more of these blue stars. The blue stars are using potable water. So those are data centers that are using potable water. And our potable water has now surpassed our reclaimed water usage, and it's increased by 250% in the last 4 years. So the point is that even though the individual data centers may be more efficient in their water usage, the sheer number of data centers that we're getting is still increasing our potable water usage significantly. Also, recreational and cultural resources. This is a picture of a cyclist on the Washington and Old Dominion Trail. And over his head is actually transmission lines that are carrying power to what's behind him, which is data centers. And there's a number of substations along this corridor, and we're seeing more and more our trails and our riparian buffers and just open space corridors being used for those transmission lines, because the alternative to getting power to these facilities, which are kind of surrounded by suburban development, is to take people's homes or to go through subdivisions or along major road corridors where everybody would see the lines, and it would detract from, scenic corridors that you're trying to create in your community. So that's why they tend to target these trails and the riparian buffers to avoid those other impacts. We're also seeing a lot of development proposed next to sensitive resources. This is one of the most egregious examples. It's Digital Gateway, which was approved in Prince William County. This is an area that was planned and zoned rural. It was supposed to stay agricultural. If you drove through it, you would see right now, because it hasn't been developed yet, it's been approved but not developed yet. If you drive through it, you would see horse farms and just like sheep and just regular, agricultural, small scale agricultural uses along this corridor. And it's all been rezoned and replanned for a massive complex of data centers, 22 million square feet of data center development. It's about 40 buildings and about 14 substations. And transmission lines obviously will be going all throughout the corridor. Basically, this is not an approval for a data center. This is an approval for a data center alley. Like, this is a massive complex, and it's a project by Compass and QTS. And it's going to have huge impacts on the adjacent national park and state forest. We're also, again, this goes back to what I was mentioning about the water quality violations. We're seeing violations to cemeteries as well. This was a news story about a couple impacts to cemeteries that happened during the construction of an adjacent data center facility. Again, they're just moving fast and they're cutting down things and dumping water places and sediment or soil places they're not supposed to. And so we're just seeing a lot of impacts to resources. So adjacent uses, I just wanted to mention this as well, not necessarily cultural uses, but this is your community and it's impacting the way that the community feels. So by putting these facilities in close proximity, they have fencing around them, security, and their sheer size just changes the feel of the neighborhood. It makes it feel much more industrial. It also makes it not walkable because, I mean, you can see in this picture here how big those facilities are behind the houses. This is no longer a walkable community. It's cut up not just by the buildings themselves and their sheer size, but also the fences that are around those buildings. So you can't put, trails easily through these areas or road connections or it just suddenly becomes a very unwalkable, unusable space. There also is a lot of speculation that starts to occur once you approve these facilities because it feels industrial in nature. All of a sudden, you start to see residential developers say, hey, my land's not worth developing as residential any longer or mixed use, and I'd like to rezone it to, data center because that's the most profitable use for me to develop. Once you get the electrical infrastructure and fiber, that also attracts, again, more speculation because now all the resources are there as well. Even if they don't actually have capacity, there's a perception that there is a substation and a transmission line. And so very often localities will be like, well, this makes sense. It's in close proximity to other industrial uses and it has electrical infrastructure, even though that electrical infrastructure very often does not actually have capacity and more electrical infrastructure has to come in with it. So what I would say is that really what are data centers compatible with? They're really the size that they're developing at now, they're most compatible with industrial or large scale office where you're not trying to have a mix of like residential and commercial. Not conducive with residential and tourism, agriculture, commercial, that sort of thing. And then there's the impact on air quality. So those emergency backup generators, as you see behind the cyclist here again, those are cycled regularly for maintenance purposes. So that diesel exhaust is being is going into our air quality. Now, they are cycled on a rotational basis, so very often it's only one at a time being, run, and it's spread out throughout the entirety of the year, so 365 days or whatever. So the impact generally is low, but here's where the concern comes in is if there's an outage, then you have all of these generators, which are the size of a train car, as you can see here, just the size of one. These things are huge. All of these, have a massive impact potentially on air quality. So I want to show you this map real quick. This is all the air permits that we have approved in Loudoun County around the Washington and Old Dominion trails. So this green line through the middle here is the Washington and Old Dominion Trail. These red dots are showing you the number of approved generators by permit around that site. We have at this point over 4,000 diesel generators permitted as backup power for data centers in Northern Virginia with a capacity of 11 gigawatts, which is comparable to all the generation of Dominion within Virginia. Now, would they all cut on at once? No, but if there is an outage event, a good chunk of them could cut on in a certain area at one time, having a massive impact on the air quality of that area. Which brings me back to this study out of University of California, Riverside and Caltech. They actually did some research on this recently, came out in December. Urge you to check it out, but it talks about the the cost of all this air pollution on our health and on the economy, or on the community, I guess I should say, maybe not the economy. Climate impacts of these facilities. So there's three areas where climate impacts start to build up. First is our scope 1, which is those diesel generators I was just mentioning, on-site power generation. And then there's scope 2, which is the power that is being brought in from the utility, and where are they getting that power from. And then there's scope 3, which I'm not going to talk about because it's completely unwieldy, but it's all of the other carbon emissions that come from the building of the facility. So it's like the concrete and the business travel and the employee commuting, and it's like everything else. So let's talk about on-site real quick. Not only are we seeing diesel generators as backup, we're also seeing them used as primary power in some cases. So we're actually starting to see natural gas tier 4 generators or gas turbines on site. We have one now in Loudoun County for 100 megawatts. We're seeing a lot more pressure on the build out of gas to meet all this this generation need. Now let's go to that scope 2. Where is this power coming from? Well, you can see where Dominion is getting most of their power. Only 5.6% is coming from renewable energy sources. 33% is coming from nuclear. And then the rest over here, about over 50%, is coming from coal and natural gas. So again, huge climate impacts from that scope 2 aspect. And then we're building out larger transmission lines to get more power over to Data Center Alley. So all those red dots need more and more power. And right now, PJM has approved 500 kV lines, an expansion of 500 kV lines out to West Virginia. One of them is going to end at the Fort Martin coal power plant. And then they've also got under review and will probably be approved in the next week or so, a 765 kV transmission lines that also go out to West Virginia and then down to Lynchburg, where there's some gas production to bring more power over to this facility. Now, what's important to note about all those lines going out into West Virginia? Well, when the 500 kV was announced to go out to Fort Martin, First Energy ditched their 2030 climate goal to take those plants offline, and they actually delayed the retirement of 2 of those facilities that were in close proximity to that 500 kV line. So this data center development is directly delaying the retirement of coal facilities that would have otherwise gone offline because they no longer made market sense because they were built 80 years ago, and it's actually cheaper to use solar and other sources of fuel. So that we're seeing the delayed retirement of these facilities. Also, Brandon Shores in Maryland was delayed as well. And then we're also seeing new gas plants being proposed. Dominion has plans to bring even more gas plants online, but this is the first one that they've brought forward, which is the gas plant in Chesterfield. And as you can see, the community is, they don't want this in their community. And the pollution that's going to be associated with it is going to bring a lot of health impacts and costs to the consumers and the residents in near proximity to these facilities. So in summary, the explosive growth of data centers is requiring massive amounts of energy and energy infrastructure. The burden of air, water, and grid impacts and community impacts is falling onto communities and threatening the Virginia Clean Economy Act and our clean energy future. And the costs of that infrastructure are being unfairly borne by ratepayers. Now, I just want to real quickly mention, because you guys might have something similar happening in Ohio, or you might be considering it. We did do a study, our General Assembly did a study of the impact of data centers, and they found that pretty consistent, and this is not, just so you understand, JLARC is not an entity that is prone to hyperbole or any kind of exaggeration. If anything, they are ultra conservative with any conclusions that they draw from the information. And so for them to say this is pretty profound. They said that the immense increase in energy demand was going to make it difficult to very difficult to provide all this power with or without the Virginia Clean Economy Act. So in other words, even throwing out the Virginia Clean Economy Act and saying, okay, we're just going to build gas and we're not even going to worry about trying to meet our goals on renewables, you still would find it would still be extremely difficult to meet this demand. And just to give you an example of how much this would take, we'd have to double our solar, the speed at which we've been bringing solar online. We'd have to find more wind sites than we currently have. We'd have to build 1.5 gigawatts of gas facilities every 2 years for 15 years. And we'd have to build a 2.7 gigawatt new nuclear facility. And we'd have to increase our import of energy by 54% to 146%. So that's going to have to come from somewhere, either West Virginia or Pennsylvania, most likely. And the level of growth that we're seeing absolutely does have an impact on the ratepayers in the form of the costs of new generation and new transmission infrastructure falling onto those people. They also found that on-site generators, although they have a minimal impact as they are operating right now, they did not consider the localized impacts of a major outage event, and they did not consider new natural gas turbines being opened up on site. And they also really don't consider all the new build out of all that 189 million square feet of data centers that we have in the pipeline. They acknowledge that data centers do use a significant amount of water and could be better managed. So they actually did encourage localities to start asking for this information and having more transparency around this information around water and asking questions about that proactively. And they did describe data centers as industrial and recommended that they not be located next to residential schools or parks and other things like that. And they did recommend that you do a noise analysis because some data centers do have noise impacts. I won't go into our whole coalition, but I'll just real quickly say we have formed a coalition. We got a lot of people working on this issue here in Virginia, and we're pushing for increased transparency, increased state oversight, ratepayer protection, and incentivizing sustainability. We've brought tons of bills forward to the General Assembly this year. There's 31 here listed. I will say a number of them have already been killed, so it is an uphill battle, and we'll be lucky if we can get any of them through. But honestly, part of the purpose of bringing all these bills forward is to simply make the case that we need transparency, we need oversight, and they are killing everything, and they're refusing to provide even the bare minimum, because we some of these bills are literally just saying assess if there is an impact on ratepayers. Just give us basic aggregated information on energy usage by existing data centers. Very basic stuff, and they're still pushing back and not allowing us to even get that through. So with that, I will open it up to questions, and thank you again for having me.
Wow, that's my initial impression. Just incredible. I'm a bit staggered here about the scope of the development and impacts and energy demands that you described in your talk. We have a lot of questions, so I'm going to turn it over to Jordan pretty quickly for questions from the audience. But I do want to ask one thing that came up during your talk. So you said a lot of these costs of the offsite infrastructure is offloaded onto ratepayers. And you also mentioned that a lot of the on-site infrastructure and equipment has to be replaced frequently. That to me means that it seems to imply that these data centers are actually quite footloose. They could you could do all this preparation, all this infrastructure, and they could be gone very quickly. They're not like steel plants that are going to be there for 50 years. So is my impression correct? And what does that say for data centers as an economic development strategy?
So I would say that is correct. And in fact, there's been a lot of discussions within the utility. The SCC here, the State Corporation Commission, just had a technical hearing actually about this very topic, about the risk to ratepayers, basically, of building out all this infrastructure. And then there's two things that could happen. One, they could not build out to the size that they had requested. So we build out all this infrastructure, we get these transmission lines and substations and power generation online, and then they only build out to 50% of what they said they were going to build out to, which means they're not purchasing that power, which means they're not paying back for all that power usage unless we have controls in place. Which I will say, Ohio AEP is actually one entity that we're watching here in Virginia because they are pushing for some protections on this. So I would support them on those efforts. That being said, though, the other risk is that the technology changes. And so you could have these facilities build out, and all of a sudden those servers actually operate for longer periods of time. And so they're there for, you know, 5 years or so. And so that has an impact on the locality's tax revenue that they're bringing in and they're expecting. And then you also have the potential that they become more energy efficient, and then they're not using as much of this power, which would be a good thing. But then you've built out all this infrastructure, and again, they're not purchasing the power and they're not paying back for all that infrastructure. Again, making a hard, basically increasing the burden on the rest of the ratepayers to pay for all that infrastructure, because we still have to pay for it once it's built. And then finally, the other aspect that you're getting at is they could also get up and move pretty easily. These are big concrete warehouses. The equipment that is within these warehouses can be, you know, put into a truck and moved over to another facility pretty readily. And in fact, that's what we've done by moving everything to the cloud. We've taken all those servers out of our office space and we've moved them to the cloud and put them into big data centers. And so, yes, there is a risk that they just suddenly decide, you know what, for whatever reason, we're not as interested in, say, the Northern Virginia market, and we're going to move some of our facilities elsewhere. I will say there's other things that prevent that from happening, though. So it depends on the entity. It also depends on the market. Northern Virginia is a tier 1 market. We have so much fiber here. We have so many companies here that they would be really hard pressed to just, you know, ditch the Northern Virginia market. But when you talk about tier 3 markets, markets that are just like, just starting up, like Mecklenburg, for example, with just Microsoft that's down there. Microsoft could suddenly decide, you know what, we really want to move to Texas. And all of a sudden, Mecklenburg is left with a bunch of empty concrete buildings, depending on if another data center wants to move in. But this boom isn't going to last forever. And I think that's one thing localities should consider. They cannot, from a market standpoint, forget the environment, forget the community impacts, which are all very important. But from a market standpoint, this boom can't last forever. At a certain point, the market will be satiated. And then localities are going to have to think about what are they going to do with all these giant concrete buildings if they're not filled up.
Thank you for that. Jordan, please. Lots of audience questions.
Yes, thanks everybody for adding your questions. There's definitely, I'll try to combine a few of these into one, but there's been a bunch of questions about kind of resistance to these efforts. Are there any regulatory changes that have been successful? And then also on the local level, have there been successful efforts by individual communities to slow down some of these processes? What sort of organizing has been effective on the local level?
Okay, so I will say, let's start with the state level. The one aspect that the industry has had, I would say, more trouble pushing back against is the ratepayer protection aspect. And that's because it's simply, we're asking for an analysis to determine if there is a subsidy, and then we're asking for a correction if there is a subsidy found, basically, if the rest of the ratepayers are subsidizing the data center industry. That's really hard to push back against, and so the industry has been struggling to push back against that narrative. The other regulatory change is what we were talking about just a minute ago, which is putting those tariffs in place at the utility level and ensuring that entities that are coming in are paying, say, 90, or they have like a guarantee that they're going to use 90% of the power that they've asked for 10 years. Stuff like that will help to protect the ratepayers and minimize that risk somewhat. And then from the local standpoint, what has been successful, I will say there's been very few data center proposals that have been denied. In the cases where they have been denied, it is because of strong community pushback and honestly very impactful proposals. So for example, there was one in Pittsylvania County that was 80 data center buildings, and it would have included I think it was 3.5 gigawatt or maybe 4 gigawatt gas plant with it. That one was denied. Thank goodness we finally got to one that was big enough to deny. Um, because I mean, nobody wanted the gas plant. That would be larger than any gas plant that we have operating in Virginia. That would be absolutely insane. So I'm really glad that that one was denied. The other time where we've seen some data centers denied is in Loudoun County, and that's because we're really feeling the impacts. And that's when localities tend to actually start to take this seriously and deny projects, is when they actually realize, wow, those transmission lines are taking people's property. We are degrading our community with all of these generators that have piled up, and wow, the water consumption has actually increased dramatically. So in Loudoun County, we have seen a couple, at least I wouldn't say outright denials, but we have seen a couple that have been reduced in scale to smaller. And we're also looking at some zoning changes here in Loudoun County to eliminate the by right zoning for data centers. They're trying to make it so that they all require a special use permit.
Got it. Thank you. We had a question noticing that many of these data centers are not multi-story, so they have a larger and larger footprint. Is there a reason for that? Or is that something that would be worth pushing for to reduce that huge industrial land footprint?
So we actually, in Loudoun County, we do have a couple 2- and 3-story data centers. You got to keep in mind the story for a data center is more like 35 to 40 feet versus your typical 10 foot story. So those facilities are upwards of 100 plus feet tall. The reason you don't see a lot of building up, the only place I've seen a lot of height in multi-floor data centers is in Data Center Alley. And that's because that market is so hot. I mean, we've got land going for $4 million an acre here in Data Center Alley. That's by right zoned for data centers. And so they are building up because land is so expensive. It's really heavy. This equipment's really heavy. The racks of servers is really heavy. And when you start to move to AI and liquid cooling, which is what's necessary to cool those really hot GPU servers that are associated with AI, that gets even heavier because now you're talking about a big tank of water and all the IT equipment. And so that's a lot of weight on the floor, and the build up gets much more expensive.
Got it. We have a couple questions. Someone says, we've read articles about small scale nuclear power facilities for electric built by the data center. Have you seen any of these kind of like micro scale facilities in Virginia?
So that's small modular nuclear reactors, and there's a lot of conversations around that. My understanding is that the Nuclear Regulatory Committee or Commission has not approved any of these small modular nuclear reactors yet. I think there's a couple that are pretty close. Like I think Oklahom's really close. And here's the thing, though, even once that's approved, you still have to get it to commercial scale, which means we need to actually start because they're too costly. They're going to be way too expensive for the facilities to run. And each one of those little small reactors only produces like 30 megawatts. So, well, 30 to maybe like 200 megawatts max. And so you're talking about a whole lot of them potentially being necessary on a campus. And we have to get to a scale where those things are being produced in a fashion that's affordable to, actually bring those all into the marketplace. And right now, that's like 10 to, I would say at least 5 years away, probably more like 10 to 20 years away.
Makes sense. And then last question, because we're running short on time. Is there a scenario where this increased demand for energy and energy infrastructure could be leveraged to modernize the grid and expand renewable energy production? Is it technically possible to reduce the size of the physical data centers? Can this demand be leveraged to jumpstart better energy production and distribution systems?
So I think that there is a potential for the industry to help to support the industry being the data center industry to help to support modernizing of the grid and to make like smart grid technology more robust. That being said, though, the sheer scale of the demand is making it so that we can't get anywhere even close to meeting our climate goals as a country. And so I would argue that we have to slow down and figure out more sustainable ways to meet this demand before we can even talk about how AI could support a more, a cleaner grid.
Okay, we're out of time. So, Julie, thank you very much. That was a great kickoff to this spring 2025 series on Is AI Sustainable? Great overview of the issues and challenges. So really appreciate your talk today and your time. And I'm sorry to the audience we didn't get to all your great questions, but stay engaged. So the next event in this series will be on Friday, February 21st at 12 p.m. Eastern Time. And this will be a panel discussion, a very interesting panel on the energy and environmental impacts of AI growth. We'll have Caroline O'Donovan from the Washington Post, Arman Shahabi from Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory, and Megan Watchpress from the Sierra Club. Kind of an interesting group of people there who are going to talk about the energy and environmental impacts of AI growth. So join us on Friday, February 21st at noon. And thank you for joining us today, and enjoy your weekend.
Thank you guys for having me.